Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to do a little bathrobe conversation on laws. Not exactly how laws work, because that's another story altogether, but the fact is, you ever hear people sit there and say, there ought to be a law against this, there ought to be a law against that, there should be a law for this? And my response often is, no, there shouldn't. Because each and every law that is created erodes a little bit more of your liberty. Do you ever think about that? Interesting thing if you do. Because if we look at the history of the United States, we have gone through a country where there basically weren't many laws at all because we had just gone through a revolution to get rid of a large government that was controlling us and taxing us and not giving us proper representation, and we had reached our limits. And we followed the philosophy of John Locke, who I talked about previously, that if a government becomes a tyrant, that it is the obligation of the citizens to overthrow it. We did that, and the American Revolution, to be honest, is very different than most revolutions. It wasn't a terribly violent revolution. Not to say that there was not bloodshed and blood lost. There was a lot. But you didn't have hand-to-hand fighting in the streets. You didn't have, like in the French Revolution, these mass executions and things like that. It was very different. Granted, there were the prison ships in New York, in which thousands and thousands of colonists and enemy combatants, as far as they were concerned, were kept and starved to death. Their bones reside in Brooklyn, by the way. It's a massive tomb that was designed by Stanford White. But we created a government to get away from large government control. Now, once we started our government, there was the battle between the Jeffersonians and the Hamiltonians. The Jeffersonians were saying, let's have a very, very small federal government. The Hamiltonians wanted a strong and powerful federal government. These two ideologies have been going at it for 200 plus years now. One of the things that's very interesting is, as soon as more Hamiltonian policies are adopted, we start getting more and more laws. We had the American Civil War, which led to a whole series of laws. One of the more fascinating things, and if you think about it, is the 13th Amendment. Very important, but also it has been used and abused in many, many different ways in making more modern laws. Study that article. It's interesting to read because it meant one thing and it has been totally interpreted to mean a whole mess of things. Now, as we move along and the country grows, we didn't really have a lot of laws, a lot of massive changes of laws until the last 50 years or so. I mean, it's incredible. The Patriot Act, if you take a look at that. Magna Carta went right out the window. We don't know it, but it did. Not the first time it was done. Something like the Patriot Act. You had Lincoln suspended the Constitution, the writ of habeas corpus. Woodrow Wilson did it to a degree. Franklin Roosevelt did it. During the Roosevelt administration was one of the darkest chapters concerning nationality. We basically took Japanese individuals who were American citizens for all intents and purposes, arrested them, put them in concentration camps, treated them dreadfully, basically because of their heritage. We didn't do it to German Americans. It's interesting if you think about that. But the Japanese were different, and they were polite. They didn't fight too much. But nonetheless, that's just a dark chapter in our history, but that was a law. But look at these recent laws. I mean, it's frightening because each law, every time you get lots of laws, you're eroding your freedoms. And it's sort of like sitting on the beach and watching the shore slowly get consumed by the surf that is moving in as the tide rises. It's imperceptible at first. You don't really notice it. And then suddenly the water hits you. You didn't realize how much everything had been changing. And then wham, when it hits you, it's too late because it's already happened. Our government is problematic right now. When you think about the size of government, and you think what it's become, the only analogy I can use to describe our present government is, in the 1950s, there was a movie called The Blob. Maybe some of you might remember it. It was a tiny little thing a guy pulled out, and it started consuming people and things and this and that. And it got larger and larger and larger and larger and growing exponentially. And it needed to be fed. It was hungry all the time. That's what our government has become. Constantly needs to be fed with new laws, new regulations, new departments. We've got departments that deal with other departments. We've got departments where people don't really know why they're a department. We've got departments that exist that we don't even know exist. You've got the CIA, you've got the FBI, you have a lot of the industrial military complex. It's all kind of hidden. It's a shadow government to a degree. All of that exists, and all of it is very hungry, and it wants more laws, because each time a law is created, the blob gets more powerful. Interesting thing if you think about it. This is what's happening right now. We don't want more laws. We want to cut back on laws. I think we should have maybe a gathering of legislators to sit there and say, is this law redundant? Let's remove it. Let's redact it. Because we just keep adding law after law after law after law. And it's insane. And you know something? The blob has grown so huge that it can't support itself. And when this happens, which happens with many governments, it collapses. So the blob is in trouble. And it needs to go on a big diet. And you need to get rid of a lot of these departments. But these are ensconced bureaucrats. And they have no intention of ever leaving. Therefore, they will get a paycheck, no matter what they do, for as long as they're there, and then a very hefty and happy pension, through the kind and wonderful courtesy of us. That's due to other laws that have been created. So, ladies and gentlemen, if someone comes running in front of you and saying, let's make a new law, why don't we sit down and talk to him and tell him he needs to get his head examined? Let's hold back on making laws about this, that, and everything else. And maybe we should sit there and talk about how to put the blob on a diet, how to reduce the size of government, how to cut back on these various departments. Many are redundant, and many are totally and completely ineffective. See, the whole thing is, a lot of time it happens in presidential campaigns. They say, I'm going to take care of this, and they create a new department, and for 2 years, it's going hell-bent for election, doing things, and then, well, Uncle George needs a job. Let's bring him in. Oh, Martha, she needs a job. Bring her in. And it becomes this big bureaucratic cesspool of legislation. And it becomes ineffective. We have so many departments like that. In fact, I'm of a mind to think that probably if we sat down and went through our federal government, that probably a good third of the departments that exist today could be removed, and no one would be the wiser or bothered by it at all, because they're totally and completely ineffective. So think about this. Think of laws. Laws are wonderful things, and we need to follow laws. But like anything, too much of a good thing isn't good. And so, the next time someone yells, there should be a law about this, say, well, maybe not. What do you think?